And today, we're diving into something pretty fundamental, but maybe overlooked in how we usually think about modern politics.
Yeah, it's this idea that the modern nation state, the sovereign, stable entity we take for granted, it wasn't just built despite indigenous peoples.
It was built in many ways because of them, or rather because of the idea of them constructed by colonial powers.
Right, so this is a deep dive into anti-colonial thought, really looking at the sources.
Exactly. And these sources, they kind of function like a mirror, showing us that the citizen, the ideal subject of the modern state, is, in a way, a reflection of the savage they were supposedly replacing.
So our mission today,
It's to unpack how indigeneity isn't just some ancient identity, but a relational, a political identity, almost a settler invention, you could say.
a settler invention. That sounds provocative.
Well, it serves as this sort of photographic negative for the modern nation state. The state is the positive image order, law, citizen,
And the negative is
like included.
the savage.
Precisely. You can't really get the positive print without that negative. So we're looking at this hidden choreography, this dance between savages and citizens that actually co-created political modernity.
Okay, so the core issue here seems to be this problem of non-recognition. It's a real tension.
It is. You have indigenous nations who are, routinely shut out of the global system of states, the UN and all that.
Yet their very existence, their land, was completely fundamental to how that system got defined in the first place.
It's a deep paradox.
Yeah.
And to really grasp it, there's a powerful story from 1923 we should start with. It involves Haudenosaunee chief Desgahe.
The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Six Nations, they had treaties with Britain long before Canada even existed, right?
Long before. So Desgahe travels all the way to Geneva. This is where the brand new League of Nations is meeting the precursor to the UN. And he's carrying a Haudenosaunee passport. His goal is to bring the conflict between the Six Nations and Canada before this international body. He's asserting their sovereignty based on those treaties.
An assertion of nation-to-nation status on the world stage. But knowing the theme, I suspect it didn't go well.
It was, well, tragically predictable, as you said earlier. The League flat out refused to even receive him.
Denied entry, just like that.
Denied entry as a sovereign equal. This wasn't just some bureaucratic oversight. It was the system defining itself.
How so?
The League was, in that moment, drawing the lines around who counts as a legitimate sovereign state. And that definition explicitly excluded existing nations that didn't fit the European model.
Because recognizing the Haudenosaunee would undermine Canada's own claims. And Britain's.
Exactly. It would unravel the territorial integrity and the very authority of its member states.
Yeah.
They couldn't open that door without collapsing the logic of the system they were building.
Wow. That really resonates with that Kafka parable, Before the Law.
It really does.
The man from the country comes to the law, there's a gatekeeper, the gate's open, but he can't get in.
And the punchline is devastating.
The gatekeeper says, "This entrance was meant solely for you. Now I am going to shut it."
It perfectly captures the political trap. Indigenous nations are essential to the story of law and sovereignty, the reason the gate exists, maybe.
But they're permanently barred from entering through it, defined by their exclusion.
And that brings us right back to that core claim. Indigeneity, as a political identity, is born with the state. It's the photographic negative.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see that connection. So let's get into section 1, the philosophical trap. How did European thinkers actually invent the savage to define their own citizen?
Well, you really have to look at the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, they needed this concept of the state of nature.
Right, the time before government used to justify why people need a social contract, why they need a state.
Exactly. It's a theoretical starting point. But, and this is crucial, our sources show this theoretical space very quickly got located geographically. Where?
In the Americas.
So Thomas Hobbes, writing Leviathan in 1651.
Midst of the English Civil War, chaos all around him.
He describes the state of nature life without a strong ruler as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He needed a justification for absolute sovereignty, the Leviathan.
But he didn't just leave it as a hypothetical. He pointed across the Atlantic. He explicitly said the savage nations in diverse places of America were living examples of this natural state of war.
So he used indigenous peoples as empirical proof.
As rhetorical proof. He needed a real-world example of what happens without a European-style sovereign. It wasn't just a throwaway line. It was politically necessary for his argument for civilization and law as he defined them.
Okay, and then John Locke comes along later. He's more focused on property, right?
Very much so. Locke's second treatise of government is foundational for ideas of private property. And for Locke, America had to be essentially a blank slate, empty potential.
He famously said, in the beginning, all the world was America, meaning a pre-political, almost timeless space, a place before history, just waiting for European labor to make it productive. Because for Locke, mixing your labor with the land created property, and property was tied to rationality, to moral worth, even to political personhood.
But the land wasn't empty. People were living there, managing it. So how did Locke justify taking it?
This is where the concept of wasteland comes in. It's absolutely devastating.
Wasteland, meaning unused.
Not just unused in a neutral sense, it meant unimproved, unowned according to a specific European logic. Locke argued that if you didn't practice settled agriculture, put up fences, use currency basically, if you didn't mix your labor in a way he recognized.
Then you had no real right to the land.
Correct. The image of the nomadic hunter or the communal farmer who didn't improve the land in the European sense became the philosophical green light for colonial appropriation. The land was deemed waste, available for those who would improve it.
So it's not just about land, it's embedding a certain kind of property ownership and maybe even whiteness right into the definition of being politically capable, of being sovereign.
Absolutely. If your way of life, your political system, your relationship with the land didn't fit the mold, you were rendered non-sovereign. Your lands were effectively terra nullius, empty of sovereignty in their eyes.
Which connects directly to the legal justification.
Exactly. Sovereignty itself got tied to this very specific, racialized, gendered idea of productive labor. If you supposedly lack the capacity for this kind of property, you inherently lack the capacity for sovereignty. Colonial capitalism's logic is baked right in.
Okay, that's the philosophical groundwork. How did this then get translated into actual international law? This brings us to the Christian law of nations and terra nullius.
Yeah, we have to talk about the doctrine of discovery. This goes way back 15th century. It's really the bedrock of international law as it relates to conquest and colonization.
And this came directly from the Pope, the papal bulls of 1493.
Yes. Pope Alexander VI, right after Columbus's first voyage, he issues the Inter Cetra bulls. These are critical. They define these newly discovered lands from a European perspective, obviously as terra nullius.
Meaning empty land.
Well, yes, but it carried the legal weight of land without a recognized sovereign, land whose inhabitants didn't count politically. And, just as importantly, the bulls labeled non-European peoples barbarians who needed Christian dominion.
So it gave Spain and Portugal a kind of divine permission slip.
A moral and theological authorization to seize territory, claim political control, and subjugate the people. It framed invasion as discovery.
And this wasn't just a Catholic thing. Other European powers adopted it.
Oh, yes. Britain, France, the Dutch, they all developed their own versions of this doctrine. It became the template. And incredibly, this basic idea was later upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court.
In Johnson v. Emmentosh, 1823.
That's the one. The court ruled that indigenous nations only had a right of occupancy, like tenants, not ultimate title or sovereignty over their own lands. The U.S. government held the discovery title.
It's worth clarifying that distinction you mentioned earlier, terra nullius versus res nullius. Why is that important for listeners maybe new to this?
Good point. Res nullius is an old Roman law idea. It means things without an owner, like a wild animal or maybe an abandoned object. Finders keepers, basically.
Okay.
But terra nullius is different. It's a modern European invention specifically about land. It didn't just mean unowned, it meant unsovereign. It declared that no political authority existed there that Christian European powers had to respect.
So by inventing terra nullius, they invented the legal justification for global colonialism.
Precisely. It provided the legal architecture for dispossession on a global scale, disguised as bringing order to empty or unruly space.
And you argue this logic didn't just vanish with the age of exploration, it still shapes things today.
Absolutely. That fundamental idea, defining a territory as underdeveloped, lacking proper governance, essentially waste, it persists.
Right.
Think about modern resource extraction.
Oil, gas, mining.
Often framed as development, right? Bringing progress to supposedly underutilized areas. It's the same underlying logic, just updated. It's the latest version of the mission civilizatrix, the civilizing mission.
So the legal basis for seizing non-Christian lands centuries ago morphed into the justification for global extractive capitalism today.
In many ways, yes. The language changes from salvation to development, but the core function of defining certain places and peoples as lacking, as needing external intervention for exploitation, remains disturbingly similar.
Okay, let's move into section 2 then. Definitional violence. If the philosophy set the stage for exclusion, state bureaucracies created the tools for erasure. How did the very category indigenous become one of those tools?
Well, the first violence is the label itself. Indigenous is not, generally speaking, how people identify themselves.
Right, they are specific peoples: Naga, Ashwar, Tikuna, Kich.
Exactly. They become lumped together as indigenous by outsiders, by the colonial state, for the purpose of managing them, subordinating them, homogenizing them. It simplifies the colonial project.
It defines them purely in relation to the colonizer, the state. Can you give an example from the Spanish Empire?
The Spanish colonial system explicitly created two legal categories, the Republic of Spaniards and the Republic of Indians, República de Indios.
So Indian was a legal status from the start.
A legal and, critically, a fiscal status. It quickly fused with racial ideas, but its core function was economic. The República de Indios had specific obligations, primarily paying tribute to the crown.
Often through forced labor systems.
Yes, systems like the encomienda or the huasipungo in the Andes, where indigenous communities were forced to provide labor to Spanish landowners or the state. Being legally defined as Indian meant you were part of this exploitable labor pool.
So the category itself was tied to economic function, producing wealth for the empire.
Absolutely central. What's fascinating and deeply troubling is how persistent this structure was. Even after Latin American countries declared independence from Spain.
New elites, the criollos, kept the system going.
Largely, yes. The colonial economic engine often continued. Take Guatemala.
You mentioned their vagrancy laws lasted until 1945.
Until 1945. These laws essentially forced indigenous men to prove they were working for wages on the big coffee plantations, the fincas, owned by the oligarchy. If they couldn't prove it, they could be arrested for vagrancy and forced to work.
So being Indian remained this marker of a subordinate, exploitable class long after independence.
It shows how these legal categories, created for colonial administration, were inherited and repurposed by the new nation-states to maintain similar structures of inequality.
Okay, that's the fiscal angle. What about how settler states like the U.S. and Canada used biology and gender to control indigenous identity?
Here we see these really insidious but quite sophisticated techniques of racial definition aimed at eventual erasure. In the U.S., the dominant tool became blood quantum.
Requiring a certain percentage of Indian blood for official recognition?
Exactly. Often 1/4, sometimes 1/2 blood degree. This is a biological metric designed quite explicitly by policymakers at the time to diminish the recognized indigenous population over generations through intermarriage. The goal was assimilation through disappearance.
And you highlighted this stark contrast with the one-drop rule used for blackness in the U.S.
It's the inverse logic, but serves the same master: colonial power and economics.
How so?
The one-drop rule, where any known African ancestry made you legally black, expanded the population subjected to slavery and later Jim Crow segregation, maximizing labor control and social division. Blood quantum, conversely, aimed to shrink the indigenous population legally tied to land rights and treaty obligations.
So one rule expands the category for exploitation, the other contracts it to extinguish claims.
Precisely. Both are tools of racial governance designed to uphold a settler colonial order, just tailored differently depending on whether the primary goal was controlling labor or seizing land.
And Canada, with its 1876 Indian Act, added a specific gender dimension to this erasure.
Oh, the Indian Act was incredibly effective in using patriarchy as a tool. It imposed European patriarchal norms onto indigenous societies, dictating that official Indian status would primarily pass down through the male line.
And the critical part was about women marrying out.
Yes. Yeah. If an indigenous woman with status married a non-status man, indigenous or non-indigenous, she automatically lost her own status. She couldn't live on reserve, couldn't access treaty rights, couldn't pass her status to her children.
But if an indigenous man married a non-status woman,
she gained status, and their children had status. It was explicitly designed to legislate indigenous women and their descendants out of legal existence, thereby reducing the number of people the state was obligated to under treaties and shrinking the land base. It also fundamentally attacked the matrilineal tradition strong in many First Nations.
This definitional violence, it even extends to how people are counted. The census itself becomes a weapon.
Absolutely. Counting seems neutral, right? Just gathering data.
No.
But in a colonial context, the politics of the count are powerful.
How did the U.S. use census data for erasure?
Federal agencies, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, often systematically undercounted indigenous populations on reservations.
Why? What was the strategic goal?
It provided statistical proof for the popular narrative of the vanishing Indian. If the numbers showed populations declining or disappearing, it justified breaking up reservations, declaring land surplus or empty, and opening it up for white settlement. The count wasn't about planning services. It was often about facilitating land transfer.
And you saw similar dynamics driven by economics in Latin America, too.
Yes, the example of Ecuador is telling. After independence, as long as the Indian tribute, that head tax, was a major source of state income, the government needed to count indigenous people accurately.
But when that changed?
When the state shifted to other revenue sources like guano exports or later oil, the fiscal need to count Indians diminished. And so Ecuador actually removed ethnic categories from its national census entirely by 1876.
They just statistically vanished them.
Legally and statistically, yes. Even though indigenous people still formed the majority of the population and their labor underpinned the economy, they were written out of the official national narrative.
But then, fast forward to Bolivia more recently, and the census becomes a tool for indigenous assertion, but in a really complex way.
Bolivia is fascinating here. It shows just how political and fluid this identity category is. In their 2001 census, something remarkable happened.
What was that?
Indigenous self-identification skyrocketed. 62% of the population identified as indigenous. This was during a period of intense popular mobilization against neoliberal policies. Claiming an indigenous identity was a powerful statement of political opposition, a critique of the state.
A tool of resistance. But then, later, after Evo Morales came to power, the country's first indigenous president, the numbers went down in the next census.
Significantly down. In the 2012 census, the figure dropped to around 40%.
Where the change?
Well, the political context shifted dramatically. Under Morales, indigeneity became, in many ways, the language of the state itself, the language of governance. So for various complex reasons, maybe people felt their identity was now represented by the state. Maybe some assimilated into the urban middle class. Maybe some felt excluded by the specific kind of indigeneity the government promoted. Fewer people chose that label.
So when it was resistance, the numbers swelled. When it became governance,
the numbers contracted. It underscores that choosing to identify or not identify as indigenous on a census form is a deeply political act, influenced by the prevailing power dynamics. It's not just a neutral demographic fact.
That really highlights the challenges in the political nature of identity. Okay, let's shift gears into Section 3, Indigenous Resurgence and Reimagining Sovereignty. Despite all this, how have indigenous peoples fought back legally and philosophically?
Well, the key thing is, they've always been fighting back, often using the colonizers' own tools. This isn't just a recent phenomenon. Think back to Chief Descahe going to the League of Nations. That was diplomacy.
And you mentioned Chief Don Diego de Torres going all the way to Spain in the 1570s.
Exactly. Crossing the Atlantic multiple times to petition King Philip II, using Spanish law to argue against the abuses happening in what's now Colombia. Indigenous peoples have consistently engaged with and tried to shape international legal and political systems from the very beginning.
Okay, so this deep history of engagement eventually led to changes in formal international law in the 20th century. Particularly through the ILO.
Yes, the International Labor Organization became an early, though imperfect, venue. Their first major instrument concerning indigenous peoples was ILO Convention 107, back in 1957.
But you said indigenous groups actually rejected that one.
Widely rejected, yes, because its whole framework was about assimilation and integration. It saw indigenous peoples as populations needing protection and development, so they could eventually be absorbed into the national society. It still treated them essentially as wards of the state, not as distinct peoples with rights.
So it was seen as paternalistic, still colonial in its assumptions.
Deeply paternalistic. So decades of intense indigenous activism and lobbying followed, pushing for a fundamental shift.
Which led to ILO Convention 169 in 1989.
Correct. And 169 was a landmark. It was the first major international treaty to recognize indigenous groups as peoples. That word is crucial.
Why peoples?
Because in international law, peoples have the right to self-determination. Convention 169 recognized rights to political authority, self-government, control over lands and resources, consultation. It was a paradigm shift away from assimilation towards autonomy.
And this paved the way for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, in 2007, which you mentioned was hugely controversial.
Hugely. It took over 2 decades of negotiation, the longest for any UN human rights instrument. The main sticking point, again, was the language of peoples and the right to self-determination.
Especially for the big settler states, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the U.S., the CANS-US countries.
They initially voted against it, precisely because they feared that recognizing indigenous groups as peoples with self-determination rights could imply a right to secession, challenging their own territorial integrity.
The core Westphalian principle of indivisible state sovereignty.
Exactly. While UNDIP is a declaration, not a legally binding treaty, its adoption was a massive symbolic and political victory. It formally recognized indigenous rights, including forms of self-determination within existing states, on the global stage.
So international law is catching up slowly. But you also talk about redefining sovereignty from below through what you call vernacular sovereignties.
Yes, this is where things get really interesting on the ground. It challenges that old idea, going back to thinkers like Borin, that sovereignty has to be this single, absolute, indivisible power located solely in the central state.
And your key example here is the Quechua women in Chimborazo, Ecuador.
Their story is incredibly insightful. They faced this double discrimination from the Ecuadorian state, which was often racist and dismissive of indigenous rights, but also sometimes from within their own local indigenous justice systems, which could be patriarchal and exclude women from decision-making.
So they were caught between two systems that didn't fully serve them.
Right. They needed a way to uphold their community's autonomy and ensure women's rights were respected within that autonomy.
How did they do it? You called it interlegality or triangulation.
Essentially, they cleverly played different legal systems off against each other. They used, 1, their own customary indigenous law, 2, the Ecuadorian Constitution, particularly its guarantees of non-discrimination and collective rights, and 3, international human rights norms like CEDAW, the Women's Rights Convention, and UNDRIP.
So they argued that for their local indigenous justice system to be legitimate under national and international law, it had to guarantee women's participation.
Precisely. They used the national state and international law not to replace their autonomy, but to act as guarantors or watchdogs to ensure their autonomous system met certain standards of internal democracy and gender equity.
That's fascinating. It's not about separating from the state, but finding ways to work with and sometimes against it simultaneously.
Exactly. That phrase they often use, sin el Estado, con el Estado, contra el Estado, without the state, with the state, against the state. It's not secession. It's about creating these pockets, these holes in the fabric of the state where legal authority is relocated and shared, challenging that top-down monolithic view of sovereignty.
This challenges the legal structure. But indigenous thought also challenges something deeper in Western modernity, right? That fundamental split between humans and nature.
Oh, absolutely. This is crucial for anyone studying political theory or even environmental studies today. That binary culture versus nature, human versus non-human, is arguably the philosophical bedrock of colonization, capitalism, and our current ecological crises.
Where does that binary come from?
You can trace its modern articulation back to figures like Francis Bacon, early 17th century. In The Masculine Birth of Time, he literally talks about needing to bind nature, make her your slave.
Wow. That's incredibly explicit. Nature as something to be dominated, controlled, exploited.
It sets up this strict hierarchy. Rational man, and it was explicitly gendered masculine, stands outside and above nature, which is seen as passive, material, devoid of agency, just resources, waiting to be understood, managed, and commodified. This philosophical move clears the way for seeing the entire planet as just stuff for human use.
The basis for extraction in the Anthropocene, really?
Many argue it's foundational, but indigenous ontologies, ways of being and knowing, often don't have this sharp separation.
Humans are part of nature, not apart from it.
Often, yes. Many indigenous worldviews see humans, animals, plants, rivers, mountains as interconnected parts of a wider community of beings, all with agency and relationships. The separation just isn't there in the same way.
And this is reflected even in language. You mentioned the grammar of animacy.
That's a fascinating concept from linguistics. Take Potawatomi, for example, as discussed by Robin Wall Kimmerer. You wouldn't refer to a bay or a hill as it, an inanimate object.
You use animate pronouns, as if they're alive, subjects.
Exactly. You speak of them as beings. English, by using it for most of the natural world, linguistically reinforces the idea that nature is object, resource. It erases agency, as Kimmerer puts it. Animate grammars constantly remind speakers of their relationship within a living world, not separate from it.
And this different way of seeing the world is now actually entering legal systems, the rights of nature movement.
Yes, this is a huge development globally. The most famous case is probably the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Declared a legal person.
Yes, after generations of Maori struggle. The river now has legal rights and interests, represented by guardians. This directly reflects the Maori understanding. Ko te awa, ko te awa, ko te. I am the river, and the river is me. It's a radical challenge to the Western legal tradition where nature is purely property.
And you see similar ideas in North America with things like the Buffalo Treaty.
The Buffalo Treaty, signed by numerous First Nations and tribes on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border, explicitly recognizes the buffalo, Yini, not as a resource to be managed, but as a relative, a sovereign actor, a partner in restoring ecological and cultural health.
So these aren't just symbolic acts. They're attempts to build governance systems based on relationship, not just extraction or human dominion.
They are concrete political and legal projects aimed at enacting a different kind of sovereignty, one rooted in kinship and responsibility to the wider living world, challenging the very foundations of the extractive state.
Okay, so we see these powerful critiques and alternatives, but what happens when the language of indigeneity becomes the state language? This brings us to Section 4, the indigenous state paradox in Bolivia.
Right, this is where it gets really complicated and maybe tests the limits of some anti-colonial theory. Evo Morales, Bolivia's first indigenous president from 2006 to 2019, his government oversaw the creation of a plurinational state.
Plurinational, meaning recognizing multiple nations within the one state.
Yes, constitutionally recognizing the existence and rights of Bolivia's diverse indigenous nations alongside the non-indigenous population. The question becomes, can you really have an indigenous state if, as we discussed, indigeneity is often defined politically in opposition to the liberal state model?
Morales certainly made huge symbolic changes. He Indianized the state, as you put it.
Absolutely. The symbolism was incredibly potent. His first inauguration wasn't in the presidential palace, but at the ancient site of Tiwanaku with indigenous ceremonies.
The wafala, the checkered indigenous flag, became an official national flag.
Alongside the traditional tricolor, yes. Andean rituals became part of state protocol. The Amara New Year became a national holiday. And crucially, the 2009 Constitution incorporated indigenous concepts like summa kamanya.
Meaning to live well or living well.
Yes, a concept emphasizing harmony, community, balance with nature, theoretically positioning indigenous values against endless capitalist growth and accumulation.
That must have been incredibly empowering for many people, a huge shift after centuries of exclusion.
Undeniably. It fostered a period of national self-reflection, brought deep-seated racism out into the open, and gave a sense of validation to indigenous communities who had fought for this for so long.
But there's always a but. The state still needed to function like a state. It needed money.
And that's the core tension. Bolivia, like many resource-rich countries in the region, is caught in what some call the Potosi Principle.
Named after the massive colonial silver mine, what's the principle?
It's the idea that the state's very existence, its budget, its ability to provide services and maintain legitimacy, is fundamentally dependent on extracting non-renewable resources, historically silver, then tin, now natural gas, lithium, usually from indigenous territories, often using methods that harm the environment.
So Morales' government, despite the living well rhetoric and indigenous identity,
Still relied heavily on gas exports to fund its social programs, its poverty reduction efforts, its state-building project. It faced a constant battle between being an indigenous state, championing Pachamama, Mother Earth, and being a liberal extractive state needing resource revenue.
and the economic reality often won out.
The pressures were immense, and this led to choices that created internal conflicts. The government tended to consolidate a particular vision of indigeneity.
Favoring certain groups over others.
Often, yes. Morales came from the powerful coca growers unions, cocaleros, in the Andes, who became a key political base. Their interests and vision of development sometimes clashed with the priorities of other indigenous groups, especially those in the Amazonian lowlands who were more focused on territorial autonomy and conservation.
And this tension exploded with the Tipiness conflict.
The plan to build a major highway through the Isaburo Secure National Park and Indigenous Territory, Tipi in office in 2011, became the flashpoint.
A highway for what?
primarily to facilitate transport for agriculture and resource extraction, connecting the Andean region with the Brazilian border, opening up the Amazonian lowlands. It was largely funded by Brazil and aimed at boosting agribusiness exports.
But the territory was legally protected and home to several indigenous groups.
Exactly. For the people living in Tipnis, the highway meant deforestation, colonization by settlers, pollution of rivers, the destruction of their way of life, and their legally recognized territory.
So you had the indigenous state pushing a development project that directly harmed other indigenous groups.
It was a profound contradiction. The government argued the highway was necessary for national development, for progress, even for bringing services to indigenous people in the lowlands. But the lowland indigenous groups saw it as dispossession and marched hundreds of kilometers to La Paz in protest.
And the government repressed the protests.
There were instances of repression, yes. It exposed the deep fault line. The state, even an indigenous one, was prioritizing national-level neo-extractivism over the territorial rights and self-determination of specific indigenous nations within its borders.
Some critics compared this to Frantz Fanon's warnings about post-colonial elites.
Yes. Fanon critiqued how sometimes newly independent nations saw their national elites simply step into the shoes of the former colonizers, maintaining the same basic structures of state power and economic exploitation, just with a different face.
So the argument is that Morales' government, while transformative in many ways, didn't fundamentally dismantle the extractive colonial foundation, the Potosi principle that financed the state.
That's the critique. The state structure, its reliance on resource rents, remained largely intact.
Which brings us back to that idea of the savage slot. If the state itself is now indigenous, where does the resistance go? Where does the savage, the one outside the state's logic, end up?
The Tip-Ness conflict suggests the slot wasn't eliminated, it was just displaced. The indigenous marchers against the state highway project became the new internal savages, resisting the national development agenda promoted by the now indigenous state citizenry.
So indigeneity as a language of resistance continued, but on the margins, precisely against the state that claimed to represent it.
It demonstrates that simply putting indigenous people or symbols in power doesn't automatically resolve the fundamental contradiction if the state remains tethered to a liberal, extractive economic model built on dispossession. The paradox persists.
Wow. Okay, this has been an incredibly rich and frankly challenging deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from Enlightenment philosophy to contemporary legal battles. Let's try and wrap up the key takeaways for you listening.
I think the first major point is that indigeneity, as we use the term, isn't just cultural difference. It's fundamentally a political category born alongside colonialism. It was the necessary other used to define the citizen and justify state formation, land seizure, via concepts like terra nullius.
Second, the dominant global system of sovereignty, the Westphalian state system, is built on principles of exclusion and that sharp human nature divide. Thinkers like Locke needed that savage in the wasteland to make their arguments for property and government stick.
And third, indigenous movements aren't just asking for inclusion into that system. They're actively challenging its foundations and offering real alternatives, paths towards what some call sovereignties in the plural. Things like interlegality, rights of nature. These are models for different ways of relating to each other and the planet, pushing back against extraction.
Which leaves us with a final thought, something for you to chew on if you're interested in political theory, history, law, or just the future.
Consider this. Indigenous struggles aren't just about specific groups in faraway places. They touch on the fundamental ways we all think about relationships with each other and with the more than human world.
The very existence of indigenous nations asserting their own forms of governance and relating to the land constantly challenges the idea that the Westphalian nation-state is the only, or the final, form of political organization.
They reveal its incompleteness. If indigeneity is defined in relation to the state, often against it, then maybe those savages are actually the ones constantly reminding the state of its limits, shaping its borders not just geographically but politically and philosophically.
They expose the systems of extraction and domination not as inevitable facts, but as historical choices. Choices that perhaps need fundamental rethinking if we want a different kind of future.